I usually choose to talk about something that seems to be, present in my mind state so that I can have some experiential knowledge about it. And that usually has to do with quite often being mindful of emotions. And, I've had various talks from time to time on mindfulness of emotions. There's a quote that I really like from the Dhammapada, in which the Buddha says, a charioteer, and that's in quotes, a charioteer, I call the one who keeps in check the unsteady chariot of arisen anger. Others merely hold the reins. A charioteer, I call the one who keeps in check the unsteady chariot of arisen anger. Others merely hold the reins. Bringing awareness to our emotions helps us have a straightforward, uncomplicated approach to our emotions. It's not so easy, but no emotion is really considered inappropriate within the field of our mindfulness practice. And so we're trying to allow them to exist as they arise without reactivity and without the additional complications of judgment, evaluation, preference, aversion, desires, clinging, attachment, all of the usual graspings of the mind. You've probably heard the story about the arrow. The Buddha once asked a student, if a person is struck by an arrow, is it painful? And the student replied, it is. And then the Buddha asked, if the person is struck by a second arrow, is that even more painful? And the student replied again, it is. The Buddha explained that in life we cannot always control the first arrow. However, the second arrow is our reaction to the first. And this second arrow is optional. And as long as we're alive, we can expect all kinds of painful experiences, the first arrow. And to condemn or judge or criticize, hate or deny the first arrow is like being struck by a second arrow. Many times the first arrow is out of our control, but the arrow of reactivity is not. And often the significant suffering associated with an emotion is not the emotion itself, but the way that we relate to it. Do we feel it to be unacceptable or justified? Or do we hate it or feel pride in it? Are we ashamed of it? Do we tense around it? Are we afraid of how we're feeling? Mindfulness itself doesn't condemn our reactions, but it's honestly aware of what happens to us and how we react to it. And the more cognizant and familiar we are with our reactivity, the more easily we can feel the pure emotion, not mixed up with guilt or anger or remorse or embarrassment, judgment, or other reactions. Freedom in Buddhism is not freedom from emotions, but it's freedom from complicating them. I've talked before, so I won't go into it this time, but about the 4 aspects of mindfulness of emotions: recognition, naming, acceptance, and investigation. So recognizing the emotion, naming it, the acceptance of it, and then investigating it. And there's no need to practice with all 4, each time that we are aware of an emotion. We can experiment to find out how they each encourage a non-reactive awareness towards emotions. So tonight I chose this idea of talking about emotion and the emotion of anger or agitation. I mean, anger itself, there's There's actually sometimes a tension that frequently arises between Buddhist teachings and Western attitudes toward anger. When teachers give a talk on anger, describing how to work with it and how not to be controlled by it and how to let go of it, inevitably somebody will say, I don't think that anger is bad or that we need to get rid of it. It can play a useful role in our lives. And these comments could sometimes come from the assumption that the English use of the word anger is the same as the Buddhist use. And often, though, these are different experiences. The Buddhist word is dosa, and it's usually translated as anger, but it might more accurately really be translated as hostility. If we recognize that hostility can be present in emotions, ranging from minor aversions to full-blown rage. Now, it's been a long time since I've been in any full-blown rage, but it hasn't been just since this morning that I've been in plenty of agitation. So while the English word of anger can include hostility, it doesn't have to. And in the West, we've had a long tradition of accepting certain forms of non-hostile anger as appropriate, like, forceful protests against injustice. But dosa burns the one who is angry. That's the Buddha's explanation, that dosa itself burns the one who's angry. Classic Buddhist teachings refer to being angry as holding a red-hot piece of coal. And for Buddhists, acting on dosa is never justified. Dosa is a form of suffering that the Buddhist practice is designed to alleviate. This kind of holding the red-hot coal. And it's what's been coming up for me recently, kind of on a regular basis, and the reason I decided to talk about it tonight. There's one ancient Buddhist text that likens dosa, this is an interesting comparison, to urine mixed with poison. Because in ancient India, urine was considered to have medicinal properties, and it was unpleasant but beneficial. However, when the urine is mixed with poison, the unpleasant medicine becomes harmful. At times, a forceful no is required from us, even though it might be unpleasant if that dosa arises. But an energized no mixed with hostility is like mixing urine with poison. Dosa holds people out of our hearts and away from our kindness and care. We don't necessarily need to avoid anger, but we do need to guard ourselves from locking others out of our hearts. And so, how can we work with this difficult emotion? Meditation can be really helpful in that we can experience our anger without inhibitions or judgments or interpretations, that we can discover a capacity for witnessing anger without either pushing it away or engaging with it. That can be a great relief, to be able to witness the anger with mindfulness without pushing it away or engaging in it. In fact, meditation might well be the safest place to be angry, to learn to let it flow through us freely without either condemnation or approval. Have any of you been aware of waking up in an agitated state? I would venture to say any woman going through menopause has. Any of us for that matter. But, waking up in kind of an agitated state. I used to wake up more with anxiety, with an unstoryline, no storyline about it, but just a feeling of anxiety. But over the last some amount of time, I've been more aware of anger and agitation on the mind upon awaking. not usually noticing a storyline, although recently I could attach a storyline to that anger. So I began to work with it to try to see it for what it is. The mind is agitated. Not that I'm agitated, for one, to see it more objectively. And recently it's been taking me a while because I have the same thing on my mind that's the storyline. And I'm identifying with it. And, I'm saying I'm agitated and upset about this. And, finally this morning as I was waking up again with this feeling of agitation, it's like I began to look closer at it, to really investigate it, to have enough mindfulness to begin moving away from it and realizing that the mind is in a state of agitation. That, what is like I ask sometimes, what is the attitude of the mind right now? And the mind is in agitation longer than I want it to be. And sometimes it takes me a while to be non-judgmental or non-reactive about it and not attached to the storyline. But with non-reactivity, mindfulness as the foundation, I'm more able to investigate anger deeply through the body, through emotions and through thoughts. And anger can open us to a world of self-discovery. I've noticed that anger tends to be directed outward a lot of the time toward an object or toward another person or events, or even, parts of myself. And in mindfulness meditation, I can turn the mind away from the object of the anger and focus it inwardly to study the source of the anger and the subjective experience of being angry or agitated. And this is what was happening to me this morning when I woke up, as well as over these last several days due to an unpleasant experience of agitation that's been on my mind for a few days now. And it's interesting how long an emotion can hang around, no matter how we wish it would pass more quickly or be more impermanent. We can investigate anger through the sensations of the body. The direct experience of anger, it might result in sensations of heat or tightness, pulsation or contraction. The breathing might be heavy or rapid, the heartbeat strong. For me today, it was more shallow. My breath was more shallow and held back. And it wasn't a full-blown anger anymore, but a very agitated state that I was trying to sift through and feeling where it is in my body, taking it away from this thought form outside of myself, to feel these sensations that, we have the practice in meditation of doing, feeling heat or pulsation or tightness or contraction. And so because these body sensations are direct and immediate, bringing attention to them helps lessen the preoccupation with the object of the anger and with the story of why we're so angry. And this in turn helps us to be more fully present for the anger in and of itself. I had so much on my mind zooming around, and as I began to just see that the mind had anger flowing through it, and letting go of the storyline enough to be fully present for the anger itself, and turning the attention away from the object of the anger is important. Because while the conditions giving rise to anger might be varied, the direct causes of hostile anger are found within the person who is angry. Mm-hmm. So these causes include aversion, grasping, resentment, fear, defensiveness, and other reactions that might be unnecessary, like the second arrow, they're often the source of the greatest pain in a difficult situation. There's this traditional folk saying that states, an enemy can hurt you physically, but if the enemy wants to hurt your heart, you have to help by getting angry. Hostile anger seems to have its roots in recoiling from our own pain. So we may react to our own sadness or loneliness, fear, disappointment, or by hurt, directing anger outwards rather than experiencing these feelings. And learning to explore our pain honestly and non-reactively through the mental events and bodily sensations, it's an important step to freedom. In my own life, I've learned that my anger tends to have two primary causes. There's fear or there's hurt. And there are times when the best way to handle a strong emotion is to give myself a timeout. If you can give yourself space to figure out the best way to address a difficult situation, it's helpful. There are times when the best ways to handle a strong emotion is to take that time out and give myself the space to figure out the best way to address it. And in the throes of reactivity, my first strategy is to notice my distress. Just really notice what's happening in the body, what's happening in the mind right now. And noticing my distress, and to take steps to find my centered self. And when I get angry, if it seems appropriate, I'll remove myself from the situation and try to be mindful of what's going on inside. If I can find the fear or the hurt underlying the anger, then if possible, if it's the right situation, I'll go back into the situation and speak from a perspective of being hurt or afraid. And over years of sitting and trying to stay present to my own racing heart and fluttering stomach without investing it with a story of what has to be done next, it's a little more easeful, despite my original impulse to want to run away. And conversations tend to be a little more helpful when I do this, partly because I'm not assigning blame. And this often lessens the other person's defensiveness or reactivity. And they may be even more inclined to maybe see their own responsibility. If it's a more benign emotion of agitation and I'm investigating the mind, I'll look at which of the emotions may be present. I may do a noting process of fear is present or hurt, find it in the body as discomfort or a jaggedness somewhere, or notice impatience in the heart and the mind. Impatience because I want it to go away. Or maybe I try to go back to touch it directly again and really be present with whatever is actually happening at the moment. I find that anger is always a signal. Mindfulness helps reveal what it's signaling. And sometimes the signal tells us that something in the external world needs to be addressed. And sometimes that something is off internally. If nothing else, anger is a signal that someone is suffering, and probably it's me. Gil Fronsdale says that mindfulness of emotions helps us to come to a place where we react less habitually to our inner urges and emotions. And that place is a good foundation from which to look carefully at situations and make wiser decisions. So the point of Buddhist meditation is not to become emotionally neutral, but through it we can open up to our full capacity to feel emotions and be sensitive to the world around us, and yet not be overwhelmed by what we feel. Having mindfulness and awareness be present as best we can. And so I guess this is sort of an invitation to you to just sit in the midst of your anger or agitation or whatever emotion might seem to be most prevalent. And it's from that center of sitting with the emotion that we can find our freedom from suffering. And so those are my reflections on anger and agitation for today that seem to have been so present. So I thought I would share them with you and see what some of your feedback is. And I'll read that Dhammapada quote one more time. A charioteer I call the one who keeps in check the unsteady chariot of arisen anger. Others merely hold the reins. So thank you for listening to the Dhamma.